Eric Williams. Eric Williams had once stood on the other side of the law. He was a practicing attorney and an elected justice of the peace in Kaufman County, Texas, a man with a robe, a title, and a comfortable future ahead of him. Then it all came apart. In May 2011, he was caught on camera removing county computer monitors from a county building. And the two men who prosecuted him for it, District Attorney Mike McClelland and Assistant District Attorney Mark Hasse, set in motion the ruin of his career. In April 2012, Williams was convicted of burglary and theft by a public servant. The conviction stripped him of his elected office and, before long, his license to practice law. He had won that Justice of the Peace seat only 2 years earlier, in 2010, and now both the title and the career behind it were gone. He placed the blame squarely on the two men who had prosecuted him. How far would a disgraced lawyer go to punish the men who had beaten him in court? The answer came on the last day of January 2013. In broad daylight, Williams ambushed Mark Hasse as the prosecutor walked toward the courthouse in downtown Kaufman. Wearing a mask, a jacket, and a bulletproof vest, he shot Hasse in front of stunned onlookers and vanished into the morning. His wife, Kim, drove the getaway car. For 2 months, the county lived in fear, unsure who had gunned down a prosecutor in the open street and whether more officials would follow. Investigators were left with a brazen daylight killing and almost nothing to go on. Then came Easter weekend, and the fear became something far worse. On the 30th of March, 2013, Williams went to the home of District Attorney Mike McClelland, 63, and opened fire with a rifle, killing both McClelland and his wife, Cynthia, 65, in what trial prosecutors would later describe as a wall of gunfire. Cynthia had never been a focus of his anger. Williams would coldly dismiss her as collateral damage. What kind of mind treats an innocent person as a rounding error? The investigation revealed just how methodical that mind had been. Williams had rented a secret storage unit, bought getaway cars under false names, and kept what amounted to a list of people he meant to harm, one that also named the sitting Kaufman County District Attorney. This was no burst of rage. It was a campaign planned in careful stages against the officials he blamed for his fall. The list that named the sitting district attorney made clear he was not finished, and that other names might have followed had he not been stopped. Even after his arrest, the consequences of his original crime caught up with him, and he was formally stripped of his law license in early 2014. Could a man who knew the courts so well really be brought down by the same system he had tried to outsmart? The break came when investigators traced the vehicles, the storage unit, and the weapons back to Williams and his wife. Both were arrested in April 2013, and Kim agreed to testify against her husband. So how does a former officer of the court answer for hunting his own colleagues? The trial was moved to neighboring Rockwall County, and in December 2014, a jury convicted Williams of capital murder. He was sentenced to death on the 17th of December, 2014. Kim Williams, who had driven the car for all 3 killings, pleaded guilty and received a sentence of 40 years. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals later affirmed his conviction, and the United States Supreme Court declined to take up his case. Today, Eric Williams remains on death row at the Polunsky Unit in Livingston, Texas, still fighting to delay the end of his case. In January 2026, a federal judge granted the state more time to answer his latest effort to halt proceedings, in which his lawyers argue that a massive volume of digital evidence had buried material that might have helped his defense. No execution date has been set. Williams aimed his revenge at the officials who had ended his career, striking from behind a mask and a carefully constructed plan. The next case turns inward, to a far more private grudge that simmered for years before one man finally chose to act on it. Robert Manor. Some grudges fade with time. Robert Manor's only hardened. In 2011, a man named Raymond Wright caused a road collision while driving under the influence, a crash that left Manor and his wife seriously injured. Wright was prosecuted for the offense, served his time, and completed his probation, paying the price the courts set. The legal account was closed. Manor's was not. For years he carried both the injury and the anger, letting them harden into something far more dangerous. And then, in 2018, he put a long-held plan for revenge into motion. Wright, by then a divorced father of 3 from the Sacramento area, vanished on the 11th of January that year. He left his ordinary routine behind and simply stopped being seen by anyone. How do you make a grown man disappear without leaving a trace? The answer involved a second person. Prosecutors said Manor did not act alone, recruiting an accomplice named Victor Gray. According to the appellate record, Gray seized Wright from a rented shop and delivered him to Manor, who then poisoned him. Wright's body was concealed and has never been recovered, which is why the case became known as a no-body prosecution, the hardest kind to prove. So how do you convict 2 men of a killing when there is no body to examine? The case cracked open by accident. Just over 2 weeks after Wright vanished, Gray was caught in a separate impaired driving crash and a high-speed chase. When his van was towed and searched, investigators found a blood-soaked raincoat that carried Wright's genetic material, along with Wright's wallet. The very man who had helped make a victim disappear had been brought down by the same kind of reckless driving that had started the entire feud years before. The evidence only deepened from there. Investigators recovered a letter Gray had written to Manor, complaining that he had not been paid for his part and referring to himself as the man who hand-delivered you your revenge. Gray's own genetic material was also matched to a cup left behind at Wright's home. Piece by piece, a killing with no body began to take a clear and damning shape. What had begun as a single bad night on the road had grown, across 7 years, into a patient and deliberate plan. On the 17th of March, 2023, a Sacramento County jury convicted both men of first-degree murder, with the added finding that the killing happened during a kidnapping. The following month, a judge sentenced both Manor and Gray to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Could a conviction built without a body survive the appeals that were sure to follow? It did. On the 20th of August, 2025, a state appeals court upheld the judgments, rejecting every argument raised. And that October, the California Supreme Court declined to review the case, closing off the last of his direct appeals. Manor is serving his sentence in a California state prison, with Gray held separately at another facility. Neither man will ever be eligible for release. Because his body was never recovered, Wright's 3 children were left without a father and without a place to bury him. Prosecutors put the motive plainly, saying Manor had carried a grudge against Wright for years before setting his plan in motion. The charges reflected how cold and deliberate that plan had been, including kidnapping that led to death. The kind of finding reserved for killings built around capture and control rather than a sudden burst of temper. The case later drew national attention when a true crime program traced how a father of 3 could vanish without a body ever being found. Why would an accomplice put his own anger in writing for police to find? That letter may be the strangest twist of all. Gray had carried out the most dangerous part of the plan. Yet he could not let go of the feeling that he had been used and underpaid. In trying to settle his own small score with Manor, He handed investigators a written roadmap straight to the heart of the case. Manor's revenge grew out of a single day on the road and a wound he refused to let heal. The next case moves out of an old grievance between strangers and into the heart of a home, where the slow collapse of a marriage built toward one early morning that would shock an entire city. Betty Broderick. For a long time, Betty Broderick had what looked like an enviable life. She met Dan Broderick at the University of Notre Dame in the mid-1960s and married him in 1969, then worked and raised their 4 children while he climbed steadily toward the top of his profession, becoming a prominent San Diego medical attorney and the respected head of the local bar association. She had given years to building the life they shared and to supporting his climb. Then she watched a younger woman step into the place she believed she had earned. In the 1980s, Dan began a relationship with his assistant, Linda Colquena, and the marriage fell apart. Betty believed that Dan, with all his legal skill and connections, had used the system against her, stretching the divorce into a 4-year battle in which she lost custody and standing. He divorced her, won the upper hand over both custody and finances, and married Linda, which left the woman who had once shared his rise on the outside of the family she had built, watching it carry on without her. What happens when a sense of betrayal is left to grow for years with no release? Betty's behavior grew more and more unstable. She left hundreds of furious and profane phone messages, damaged property, and at one point drove her car straight into the front of Dan's home. The warnings were impossible to miss, and friends and family watched the situation spiral. Yet no one managed to pull the two of them back from the edge, and the conflict only escalated with every passing month. Then, in the pre-dawn hours of the 5th of November, 1989, it reached its terrible end. Around 5:30 in the morning, using a key she had taken from her daughter, Betty slipped into the bedroom where Dan and Linda lay sleeping and fired 5 shots from a .38 caliber revolver. 3 of them found their mark. When Dan reached toward the phone, she tore it from the wall, cutting off any call for help. Both Dan and Linda were dead before the neighborhood had even begun to stir. Was this the act of a woman pushed past her breaking point, or a calculated execution? That question divided everyone who followed the case. Her first trial ended with a hung jury in 1990, as jurors split over what had truly driven her. A second trial in 1991 reached a verdict, convicting her on 2 counts of second-degree murder. She was sentenced to 32 years to life, the long term carrying an added penalty for the use of a firearm, and her story went on to fuel a long public argument over how to weigh a wronged spouse against a calculated act of revenge. For decades, Betty maintained the bitterness that had defined her case. The parole board denied her release in 2010 and again in 2017, pointing to her continued lack of remorse, and set her next opportunity for the early 2030s, years into the future. She would not live to see it. So how did one of the most talked about cases in San Diego history finally close? Betty Broderick died on the 8th of May, 2026, at the age of 78. Weeks earlier, she had been moved from the California Institution for Women to an outside medical facility. After a fall broke several of her ribs, an injury that led to a fatal infection she was unable to overcome. According to her son Rhett, she passed of natural causes, with 3 of her children at her bedside and another joining her by video. After more than 3 decades behind bars, fighting her case to the last, she never once walked free. The 2 people she killed were still young. Dan was 44, and Linda, the assistant he had married, was only 28. The case quickly became one of the most talked about in the country, replayed on television and argued over endlessly in legal circles, and it would keep Betty's name in the public eye for decades afterward. Broderick's revenge was rooted in a marriage that fell apart and a wound she carried for years. The next case carries that same sense of grievance into a very different world, where a single dismissal from a career set off a plan that would not be fulfilled for years and would reach far beyond the single man who had delivered it. Anthony Garcia. Anthony Garcia had trained to save lives. A licensed physician, he had once been a resident in the pathology program at Creighton University School of Medicine in Omaha, Nebraska. That path ended in the summer of 2001, when he was dismissed from the program by two of the men who ran it, Residency Director Dr. William Hunter and Department Chairman Dr. Roger Brumback, over serious concerns about his conduct in the program. The dismissal did not stay in the past. It followed him from state to state, blocking his attempts to win a medical license elsewhere. In one case, a state board denied him a license in 2012 after Brumback confirmed he had been let go for cause. Each rejection seemed to deepen the grudge he held against the two doctors he blamed. How long can a single grievance smolder before it turns deadly? In Garcia's case, the answer was years. On the 13th of March, 2008, a young member of Dr. William Hunter's household and the family's housekeeper, Shirley Sherman, were killed inside the Hunter family home in the Dundee neighborhood. Dr. Hunter was not there. Investigators came to believe the attack had been aimed at his family precisely to inflict the deepest possible pain on the man who had ended Garcia's career. For 5 years, the killings went unsolved. The connection to a long-ago firing stayed invisible to those investigating, who had no obvious reason to link a quiet family home to a pathology program across town. Then the grudge surfaced again, and the silence broke. On Mother's Day, the 12th of May, 2013, Dr. Roger Brumback and his wife, Mary, both 65, were killed in their Omaha home. That same day, Garcia also tried to force his way into the home of another Creighton pathologist. Two doctors who had once judged him unfit, along with the people closest to them, had now been struck across a span of 5 long years. What finally connected a former resident to a string of deaths years apart? The pattern itself became the clue. Both households were tied to the same pathology program and the same dismissal. And once investigators looked at who held a grudge against both Hunter and Brumback, Garcia's name rose to the surface. On the 15th of July, 2013, he was arrested on an Illinois highway, impaired and carrying a loaded handgun, his long run finally at an end. So how does the justice system answer a revenge plot that took 4 lives? In October 2016, a jury convicted Garcia on 4 counts of first-degree murder. After the state confirmed its death penalty, a panel of 3 judges sentenced him to death in September 2018. The Nebraska Supreme Court upheld both the convictions and the sentence in 2023. And in December 2024, it rejected his bid for a new trial. Today, Anthony Garcia sits on Nebraska's death row at the Tecumseh State Correctional Institution, his state appeals now fully exhausted. The former doctor who once promised to do no harm spent more than a decade turning his anger into a plan that destroyed 2 families, all to settle a score over a single job he had lost more than a decade before. The dismissal had cost him more than a single job. It trailed him from one state to the next as he tried to build a career, and at least once a licensing board turned him away after Brumback confirmed he had been let go for cause. Every closed door seemed to point back to the same 2 men, and the resentment kept building in the years between the 2 attacks. How does a trained doctor move so freely between healing and harm? For years, Garcia kept up the appearance of a physician looking for work, polite and unremarkable to those around him. Behind that front, prosecutors said, He was tracking the families tied to his program, choosing his moments and counting on no one linking a former resident to deaths that appeared to have nothing in common. If you've made it this far and enjoy deep dives into the most shocking criminal cases, hit that subscribe button and don't forget to press the bell icon. Garcia's revenge was aimed at the people who had ended his career, and it reached through them to their families. The next case shifts the motive entirely to a parent driven not by a job or a marriage, but by a wound struck against his own family, in a moment that would play out in front of live television cameras. Gary Plauché. Gary Plauché was an ordinary father from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, until a single act made his face known across the country. In 1984, his young son had been harmed by the boy's own karate instructor, a man named Jeff Doucette, who was 25, and who then took the child far across the country before he was finally recovered. Doucette was arrested and extradited back to Louisiana to answer for it, and a trial was set to begin. But Plauché did not wait for that trial to run its course, and he never had any intention of doing so. On the 16th of March, 1984, Doucette was escorted in handcuffs through Baton Rouge Metropolitan Airport at around 9:30 at night. Plauché was waiting near a bank of payphones, a telephone receiver held to his ear and his back turned, looking for all the world as if he were lost in an ordinary conversation. As Doucette passed, Plauché turned and fired a single shot into the side of his head from close range. Doucette died the following day. What set this killing apart from almost any other was that the world watched it happen. A television news crew, tipped off that Doucette would be arriving, had its cameras rolling, and the shooting was captured on film. In the footage, an officer who recognized Plauché can be heard crying out his name in shock and disbelief. The raw, unscripted nature of it turned a private act of revenge into a national talking point almost overnight. Debated everywhere people gathered. How does the justice system respond when a father takes the law into his own hands, on camera, in front of everyone? In Plauché's case, with striking leniency. He was initially charged with second-degree murder, but he pleaded no contest to the lesser charge of manslaughter. During the proceedings, a psychiatrist testified that, in the instant he pulled the trigger, Plauché was not able to tell right from wrong, a conclusion that would weigh heavily on the outcome. In August 1985, Judge Frank Saya handed down a 7-year suspended sentence, along with 5 years of probation and 300 hours of community service. He served no time in prison beyond his initial detention. Why would a judge let a man who killed in plain sight walk out of court a free man? Judge Saya explained from the bench that sending Plauché to prison would not help anyone involved. Much of the public agreed with that view, seeing him not as a cold and calculating killer, but as a parent driven well past the edge by what had been done to his own child. Few cases have ever drawn such open sympathy for someone who admitted to taking a life. So what became of the father at the center of it all? Gary Plauché lived for 3 more decades. He suffered a stroke in 2011 and, after a second one, died on the 20th of October 2014 at the age of 68. He never once expressed regret for the shooting, and he said more than one time that he would do the very same thing again if he were ever placed in that position. His son Jody grew up to turn the experience into something larger than himself. He became a public speaker and counselor focused on protecting young people, traveling to talk openly about his own experience. And in 2019, he published a book about his life and his father, keeping the story in front of new audiences and using it to open the kind of difficult conversations that many families would rather avoid. The details of what led there only sharpened the public's reaction. Doucette had taken the boy by bus all the way to California, where the boy was held for roughly 10 days before he was recovered and the instructor was taken into custody. The footage of the airport shooting, meanwhile, went on to become one of the most widely circulated clips of its kind, replayed for years and shown in countless discussions of vigilante justice long after the case itself had finally closed. Plauché answered a wound to his own family in the middle of a crowded airport, and the courts went on to meet him with rare understanding. The next case carries that same impulse into a very different setting, a courtroom, where another parent reached a breaking point and decided the system had not gone far enough. Ellie Nessler. Ellie Nessler was a single mother living in Tuolumne County, California, when her life collided head-on with a man named Daniel Driver. Driver was on trial, accused of harming several young boys, including Nessler's son, at a Christian camp years earlier. He was not a first-time defendant either. He already carried an earlier conviction for a similar offense, one for which he had served only a short stretch before being released, a record that made his appearance back in court all the more unbearable to the families involved. To Nessler, the system looked as though it was failing all over again, and she had reached the very end of her patience with the process that was supposed to protect her family. On the 2nd of April, 1993, during a break-in Driver's preliminary hearing at the Jamestown Justice Court in Tuolumne County in front of officers, attorneys, and stunned onlookers, Nessler walked in and fired 5 shots into Driver's head, ending his life inside the very building that had been meant to judge him. She had reached the firm belief, somewhere along the way, that no court was ever going to deliver the outcome she felt her family deserved, and she was no longer willing to leave that outcome in anyone else's hands. Could a grieving mother who shot a man in open court ever be treated as anything but a killer? The answer turned out to be complicated. A jury convicted Nessler of voluntary manslaughter with an added penalty for using a firearm, and in a separate phase of the trial, it rejected her claim that she had been legally insane at the time she fired. On the 7th of January, 1994, Judge William Pauley sentenced her to 10 years, describing what she had done as essentially an execution carried out in a hall of justice, a striking phrase for a case so wrapped in public sympathy. But the case was far from over. In 1997, the California Supreme Court overturned her conviction, finding that a juror had brought improper outside information into the deliberations, a flaw serious enough to taint the entire verdict against her. Rather than face a full retrial, Nessler accepted a deal, pleading guilty to voluntary manslaughter, and she was released that same year after serving roughly 3 years behind bars for the shooting she had carried out in open court. So did freedom bring her any peace? It did not last. In 2002, Nessler was sentenced to 6 years on controlled substance charges that had nothing to do with the shooting, and she served part of that term before leaving prison in 2006. Her later years were shadowed by illness and by fresh tragedy that struck within her own family. Nessler had been fighting breast cancer since the mid-1990s, throughout her time in and out of custody, and the disease at last caught up with her in her final years. She died on the 26th of December, 2008, at the age of 56, at a medical center in Sacramento. By the time she passed, her son William was himself behind bars, serving a long sentence of 25 years to life for a deadly assault that took place on the family property, and he was unable to attend her funeral. The weapon she used told its own story. It was a small .25 caliber pistol that she had taken from her sister and slipped into the courthouse. A quiet and deliberate choice rather than a weapon grabbed up in a sudden moment of rage. The earlier conviction that had failed to keep Driver away had ended with only a few months behind bars, a fact that fed her conviction that the courts would never truly hold him to account. By her own words in the aftermath, she had felt she was acting in the place where the law would not, going so far as to compare herself, in her grief and fury, to something close to a force beyond any court. It was a statement that captured both her certainty and just how far past reason the loss and the long wait for justice had pushed her by that point. Nestler acted inside an American courtroom, and the public never fully agreed on whether to condemn her or understand her. The next case crosses the ocean to West Germany, where, years before Nestler, another grieving mother had walked into a courtroom and done something strikingly similar. Marianne Bachmeier. Marianne Bachmeier ran a small pub in the city of Lübeck, in what was then West Germany, and raised her young daughter Anna very largely on her own. In 1980, that world was shattered when a local man named Klaus Grabowski, who worked as a neighborhood butcher and already carried a record as a convicted offender, took the life of her daughter and concealed what he had done. Grabowski was arrested and put on trial, and Bachmeier was forced to sit in the same room, day after day, as the man responsible for her loss. What she chose to do next would make her one of the most talked-about figures in the entire country. On the 6th of March, 1981, on the third day of Grabowski's trial, Bachmeier carried a small pistol into the Lübeck courtroom and opened fire. She fired a total of 7 shots, 6 of which struck him in the back, killing him almost at once where he sat. Then she set the weapon down and surrendered without a struggle, later saying simply, "I did it for you, Anna." Was this a spontaneous act of grief, or a decision she had quietly made long before she ever walked through the courthouse doors that morning? That question sat at the center of her trial. Part of what had driven her, by her own account, was not only the loss itself, but Grabowski's conduct in court, where he tried to shift blame onto the child who could no longer speak for herself. His defense also argued that earlier medical treatment had left him unstable and not fully in control, an explanation that did nothing at all to ease the anger of a mother sitting only a short distance away. To Bachmeier, stopping him from staining her daughter's memory was as much a motive as revenge itself. The German court wrestled with how to judge a mother in her position. She was initially charged with murder, but in 1983 she was convicted of the lesser offense of manslaughter, along with the unlawful possession of a firearm. The court concluded that she had acted spontaneously, while under extraordinary emotional strain, a finding that shaped the relatively short sentence that followed. She was sentenced to 6 years and ultimately served 3 of them before her release in 1985. A punishment many felt was remarkably light for a killing carried out in front of a courtroom full of witnesses. How does a person even begin to rebuild a life after something like that? Bachmeier tried to do exactly that, far from the country that knew her face. After her release, she moved abroad, living in Nigeria, where she married, and later settling in Sicily, putting an ocean and a new life between herself and the headlines that had followed her at home. For a time, she stepped out of public view almost entirely. But she would return to Germany under the hardest of circumstances. After being diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, Bachmeier came home to a reunified Germany to live out her final months in the country that had never forgotten her. She died on the 17th of September, 1996, at the age of 46, in a Lübeck hospital, and was finally laid to rest beside Anna, the daughter whose death had set the entire tragedy in motion years before. In her final stretch of life, she allowed a filmmaker to document her story, making sure that her own version of events would outlive her. She never expressed remorse for what she had done in that courtroom, holding firmly to the belief that she had acted as almost any mother in her place might have been driven to act. Her case was debated in newspapers, in living rooms, and in court across the country, and it remains one of the most studied vigilante cases in modern German history. Decades later, the basic facts still draw attention. A grieving mother, who carried a loaded firearm into a courtroom, turned it on the man on trial in front of everyone present, and then calmly set it down and waited quietly for the police to arrive. Bachmeier acted out of a mother's grief, and many who followed her case struggled to fully condemn her. The next case turns to a far darker and far less sympathetic kind of revenge, aimed not at any one person who had caused real harm, but at strangers singled out only for who they appeared to be. Mark Stroman. Mark Stroman did not hide what he believed. A self-described white supremacist and a member of the Aryan Brotherhood of Texas, he carried his hatred openly and made no secret of it. He also arrived at that point with a long criminal history behind him, including burglary, robbery, theft, and 2 earlier prison terms. In the weeks after the attacks of September 11th, 2001, that hatred hardened into a shooting spree across the Dallas area, aimed at men he wrongly assumed to be Arab or Muslim. His first target was Waqar Hassan, a Pakistani immigrant who ran a small grocery store. Stroman shot and killed him on the 15th of September 2001, only days after the attacks he claimed to be avenging. Days later, on the 21st of September, he walked into a gas station and shot Rais Bhuiyan, a young immigrant from Bangladesh who was working as a clerk, in the face. Bhuiyan survived, but he lost the sight in one eye and would carry dozens of embedded pellets, along with the scars, for the rest of his life thereafter. Then, on the 4th of October, Stroman killed Vasudev Patel, an immigrant from India, during a robbery at another gas station, a shooting captured clearly on the store's own security camera. How does a man even begin to justify hunting strangers he has never met? Stroman wrapped his violence in the language of patriotism. He claimed his spree was revenge for the September 11th attacks, and even invented a story that a sister of his had died in the World Trade Center, a person court records could find no evidence had ever existed at all. He gave himself a hateful nickname and spoke of the killings as though they were a kind of patriotic service to his country. But there was a glaring flaw at the heart of his stated motive. None of the 3 men he targeted were Arab. All were from South Asia, and one was Hindu, not Muslim at all. The revenge he imagined himself taking had no real connection to the people he actually harmed, who shared little beyond their appearance and the assumptions a stranger made about them. Each of his victims was simply a working immigrant trying to make a living. Hassan in his 40s and Patel close behind him in age, when their paths happened to cross his. So how did the law finally catch up with him? Because only the killing of Vasudev Patel had been caught on camera, Stroman was charged with capital murder in that single case, the one prosecutors could prove beyond doubt. He was convicted in April 2002 and sentenced to death within days of the verdict. Even at trial, he showed no flicker of remorse, at one point making an obscene gesture toward the relatives of one of the men he had killed, treating the entire proceedings with open contempt. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals upheld his sentence the following year, and the United States Supreme Court later declined to intervene, leaving the death sentence firmly in place. Then came a twist almost no one expected. Rais Bhuiyan, the man Stroman had left partially blind, began campaigning to save his attacker's life. Citing his faith and its teachings on forgiveness, Bhuiyan filed a lawsuit and a clemency petition, backed by major human rights organizations, and even spoke with Stroman directly by phone in the hours before the execution, urging that his life be spared. The courts and the governor declined to step in. On the 20th of July, 2011, Mark Stroman was put to death by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit at age 41. In his final words, The man who had set out to spread fear spoke instead of peace and regret, saying that hate causes a lifetime of pain and calling for it to finally come to an end. Could anything good come out of a story built on so much hatred? In its strangest and most lasting turn, it did. But Huiyan went on to found a non-profit called World Without Hate, an organization dedicated to breaking the cycle of fear and retaliation that had so nearly killed him. He remains alive today, the survivor who fought to spare the life of the man who had tried to take his, and who chose to spend the years that followed working against the very kind of hatred that had so nearly ended his own life. This was all from our side today. Thanks for watching. Click here to check out another video.